Good morning. Welcome to week 2 of the Heritage Ohio Conference. This morning, first I want to remember to thank Sandvik Architects for being the title sponsor. Schooley Caldwell is today's Monday sponsor. They'll be sponsoring the whole day. And the State Historic Preservation Office, which has been our AIA credit sponsors. We have 1.5 HSW credits. If you want your HSW credits, please email Devin Miles at officemanager@heritageohio.org and include your AIA member number so that he can send you the notification. So this morning, I want to again thank Schooley Caldwell for being our sponsor and send it over to Paula Ryan.
Thank you, Joyce. Ryan with Schooley Caldwell. We're happy to sponsor today's program. I'd like to introduce Tim Monet. Tim is our speaker this morning. He is the chief building official for the city of Worcester, and he's had that job since 1999. He is also a state of Ohio certified building official and a certified building inspector, an International Code Council certified building official and certified building official. And with that, I'll give you Tim to start this morning's program.
Thank you, Paula. I just want to thank Heritage Ohio for the opportunity to present this morning. I mean, I do appreciate all the work that you do in our communities. The Main Street program has been a really big player in our downtown here in Worcester. And I know it's a point of pride in the community. People from Worcester, when they're telling their friends or their family, when they're visiting Worcester, when they're talking about the town, they like to talk about downtown and what's going on. And it's such a big part of our community here. And Worcester's had some impressive accolades recently. In 2017, Ohio Magazine picked it as the best hometown in Ohio. Money Magazine picked it as the 37th ranked town out of the top 100 in a city this size. So one of the top places to live. And there's been, other accolades as well. So we've had a lot of success in downtown Worcester, and I think you've helped a lot in that regard. But we want to talk a little bit this morning about building codes and how can building codes help you, and why should we take a look at those? Really, why do I even care? Well, as we stated, we know that the importance of our historic downtowns and our downtown buildings can hardly be overstated. As I said, here in Worcester, it really defines the character of our downtown. And providing buildings that are safe to occupy, they don't pose a threat or a hazard to anyone, or a hazard to an adjacent building, is really vital. And we know, number two, that building officials and building departments do have a significant impact on the renovation projects in our downtown and the reuse of our structures. As was mentioned, I've been a building official here in Worcester over 20 years, so I've seen this firsthand, and I've heard from a lot of my peers around the state, and also from a lot of building owners and their experiences in trying to rehab their buildings. And so I think that it's very true that building officials and building departments play a major role in this. And lastly, I'd just like to say, if any of you have ever built a house or you've had a major renovation project or an addition, you know how difficult that can be, the whole process. And building code and inspections are a part of that. But just think about applying that experience to a very old or historic building in the downtown, and just the layers of complication that would be added by the scale of that. And many times it may just seem impossible to comply with the code, the current code. And it can seem physically or financially impossible as well. So I think in having this positive and productive dialogue with all of the team players on a project is really important. And so having the basic working knowledge of the code, I think, will help you. I'd like to just say, talk a little bit about the building codes and the local building official. All construction codes are adopted at the state level in Ohio by the Department of Commerce. They become part of the Ohio Administrative Code. In effect, they're really state law, and they have to be adhered to. So all the building departments that enforce the code have to be certified by the state of Ohio. All of the personnel that are enforcing the code, all of the inspectors, they also have to be certified. And so each building department will have one certified building official who's sort of responsible from the state's point of view for the interpretations and enforcing the code in that jurisdiction. Now the state, they do not allow a building department to make their own rules or to make additions to the code or amendments to the code or adopt their own code. Everyone in Ohio is using the same code. They're following the same rules, and so there should be some consistency there. Now, you see there in the last section, there's sometimes you'll be dealing with a local building department in your city, sometimes a county building department, or sometimes the state. So if your city does not have a certified building department, the city can contract with the county to do building code enforcement in that jurisdiction. Now it's interesting to note that probably, I think it's less than half the counties in Ohio have a certified building department. So if your downtown is in one of those areas where there's no county building department, no city building department, then the state of Ohio building department will be enforcing the rules of the Board of Building Standards and the building code in that jurisdiction. So while the code comes from the state of Ohio, I'd just like to mention that the technical parts of the code, they're all developed by the International Code Council. And Ohio then takes the International Building Code and they model the building code after that. They added an administrative section and some of those administrative rules, but essentially the technical provisions are from the International Code Council. And so that would include the fire code, the building code, plumbing code, HVAC code, would include the accessibility code, energy efficiency code. So all of these codes are coming from the International Code Council. Now, the International Code Council, incidentally, also publishes an international existing building code. And it's sort of a standalone code for existing buildings. And the International Building Code no longer uses Chapter 34, which is the code for existing buildings in Ohio. They now, by reference, go to this standalone code. Now, Ohio hasn't done that yet. We're still using Chapter 34 in the Ohio Building Code, but I think in the future, you're likely to see that happen. So when you're talking about all of these rules and the codes and everyone's role, at times I think it can sound a bit bureaucratic, and sometimes it can be bureaucratic. And I know there are people that like to lump building codes and enforcement with these stereotypical government regulations, ones that can sort of be a strain on business, add compliance costs, costs that get passed on to owners. And I think in some areas or at times that can be legitimate. They can be enforced in that manner, and that reputation is earned by some in our profession. And we've not always done a good job. But I think what we strive for is to present the code in clear language, try to make it easy to understand, and liberally interpreted to the benefit of the building owner whenever possible. And otherwise, it can be a drain on economic development. That's a problem. Project delays mean higher costs. They can mean less development. They can discourage development, less buildings rehabbed in a downtown, less tax revenue, less jobs, and buildings left to deteriorate. And so I think there have been a few studies that show when all things are equal, that a predictable and a efficient permitting process and code enforcement process, that investment dollars will flow to that area. And when you think about it, I mean, investment dollars it's fungible. If they can't invest in your area or your downtown because it's so difficult, they may be likely to go somewhere else. And so it can be a real problem in an area. Just like to take a moment and talk about the process a little bit. And you see that there's owners and architects and engineers, contractors, and yes, the building department. So when you have good development, you have good dialogue and cooperation among these parties. And good development is the foundation on which, good communities and good downtowns are really built. Makes it a lot easier to implement your comprehensive plan or your downtown strategic plan or your community vision when people are cooperating together. And I will say, from time to time, I found that it may take a change of attitude for some of the team members. Sometimes they do view us as a bureaucracy and that codes are just creating delays or adding to project costs. And I think we got to get past that. And I think it's really incumbent on the building departments to do that, to show that codes have value, that the building inspectors can bring real value to the project team and to the project, and that these codes are a valuable public service. And I think that's where we want to get to. I'd like to talk here about different types of building officials. And I think these are all well-intentioned. These are building officials working to do a good job. Now, in the first case is the good-intentioned building official. And you see it's like the dog, he's doing his job, he's fetching, but he's bringing back dynamite. He's well-intentioned. And I think this is the building official who says, I'm kind of by the book. I'd like to err on the side of safety. I think that's well-intentioned, but the problem is if you're going to apply the most stringent requirements, it might be fine if they didn't have a real financial impact to a project. So when we're not really sure what the code says and we make it more restrictive, more stringent than it really needs to be, it can really cause problems in a project. So while there's good intentions there, the results are not so good. I think the second type here is the building official that's accommodating and flexible and really wants to do a good job and is very affable and easy to deal with. And I think we've done a good job in trying to do a better job at providing good service. I'd like to just read a section from the Ohio Building Code. It's 104.2 in the administrative section of the Ohio Building Code. It says, quote, all building officials shall conduct themselves in a professional, courteous, impartial, responsive, and cooperative manner, unquote. Think about that. They actually had to put that in the code, that we have to be professional, courteous, responsive, cooperative. Now, why did it have to make its way into the code? I think we weren't always viewed that way, and we didn't always conduct ourselves that way. But really, it's a requirement in the code that we have this kind of attitude, and I think that's important, and you do see that in building officials doing a good job of that. But I think this third type is really the place we want to get to. And I like this quote from Betty Williams, who was a well-known peace activist, won the Nobel Peace Prize. And I like to tell folks this when this comes up, but there's no use talking about the problem unless you talk about the solution. And that's what she was known to say. And I'll use that a lot when I have my staff will come and they'll have a problem, and I'll ask them, well, really, what's the solution? What would you do? And I think that's where the building officials need to get to, where they're viewed as a resource, as a problem solver. They're going to get more compliance, more safety. People will seek you out for your expertise. And I just like to mention too, before we move on, the fire safety inspectors and the fire department is also very important in applying codes in the downtown area or historic buildings. Now, the fire code predominantly is a maintenance code. I mean, the fire safety inspector is going to go into buildings periodically, and he's going to look at the certificates of occupancy, make sure that the buildings are still being used the way that they're permitted to be used according to the certificate of occupancy. He's going to be looking at fire suppression systems, make sure they had their annual test. The same with fire alarm systems. Maybe they're going to look at how any hazardous materials are stored. And so it's a maintenance code that works hand in glove with the building code. But I think it's also very important that they are on the same page and they're working together and pulling in the same direction. It doesn't work if a building department or a building official approves of a certain approach or approves of a certain interpretation of the code, only to have the fire official not support it. Now, I'll say here in Worcester, this has ebbed and flowed through the years, but for the last several years, we've had a very good working relationship. It's the best that I ever recall. We have a very good fire department, and our fire safety inspectors are awesome. They work with us every day. We work together, and we come up with solutions together. And I think that's the place you have to get to if you really want to have success in enforcing the code in the downtown areas. So here's the 4 tools that can help us, the 4 main tools, and really all solutions or approaches are going to fall into one of these categories. First of all, the codes need to be liberally construed. Now, what that means, in the Ohio Building Code in Chapter 1, which is the administrative section, under intent, it reads like this, quote, "The rules of the board or the code shall be liberally construed in order to promote its purpose. When the building official finds that the proposed design is a reasonable interpretation of the provisions of the code, it shall be approved," unquote. So in order to do that, I think an understanding of the codes has to be achieved, and understanding the intent of the codes. And you can make decisions to the benefit of the building owner or the designers. And I think that's an important point. Secondly, historical buildings are just treated differently in the code. There is a compliance discretion that's provided for in the code, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later in some detail. And number 3, expertise with Chapter 34. So that's an important chapter in the building code for downtown development. Now, if you go back to the early development of Chapter 34 in the legacy codes, and so there were mainly 3 legacy regional codes in Ohio. And if you look back at some of the testimony that was given way back when Chapter 34 was being developed, the intent or the philosophy of this chapter has always been to allow changes in buildings if they become at least as good or better than they were before the proposed change. Basically, you're at least maintaining the level of safety in a building, and you're not making it any worse or less safe. It's an acceptable level of compliance that's different than the compliance that's required for a new building. And then lastly, building owners can make formal appeals to the State of Ohio Board of Building Appeals in Columbus. Now, the states established this board to hear cases and grant relief to building owners that need relief from certain sections of the code, and you may not have, the building official doesn't have legal authority to waive a provision of the code, but an appeal can be received, and the building department can help with that process. Now, just as an example of that, here in Worcester, I went back and I looked at some of our records for appeal cases, and I know the 5-year period around the year 2000 to 2006, we had a lot of buildings undergoing renovation downtown. So I went back and just took that 5-year period and looked at our appeal cases. We had 18 appeal cases presented by building owners seeking relief from certain provisions of the code during that time period. 39% of those cases involved some code provision regarding a sprinkler system. Now, I think it's important to note that in those cases, in all but one of those cases, the fire department was in agreement and supported these appeal cases. In all but one of the 18 appeal cases, the fire department approved and worked with us to come up with an acceptable plan for these buildings. And these plans included appealing certain provisions of the code that we didn't have authority to just waive those provisions. So it's a very powerful tool that can be used on a project when you get to a sticking point and find a difficult problem. Now, I want to talk here for a moment just about the building code in chapter 34 and existing buildings. This chapter that we're going to talk about in great detail, it really, some of the text of this chapter 34 had its beginnings here in the state of Ohio, going all the way back to 1981 with House Bill 351. Now, this text from that House bill eventually was adopted into these regional model codes. Now, when I first started here in Worcester in the late 90s, we used a building code called the BOCA building code. And that was an acronym that stood for Building Officials and Code Administrators. Now, in that code, there were only a couple of pages that were devoted to existing buildings. Now, those model regional legacy codes were all sort of rolled into the International Building Code, the first one in 2000. And this chapter 34 made its way into the International Building Code and was expanded to about 14 pages. Today, I think it's 19 or 20 pages. But the International Code Council, as I had mentioned, went even further in developing this International Existing Buildings Code. And this code has about 67 pages of code text, and there's over 200 pages of appendices and resource materials. And it truly is going to prove to be a one-stop shop for all of the provisions needed to rehab an existing building. Now in Ohio, we haven't adopted the International Existing Building Code. We're still using and maintain Chapter 34, but I think in some future edition of the Ohio Building Code, you're going to probably see that change. Now, I get a lot of calls from people with code questions. So I'm going to teach everyone how to answer any code question that you may get about any particular building. The answer is, it depends. Now, you'll see that's true. I'll give you an example. I'll get a call. Typically, I get a call about once a month. Somebody will call and they'll say, hey, I'm thinking about opening a restaurant downtown in such and such a building. Can you give me a checklist of all the applicable codes or everything that I need to do to open that restaurant? And I think people think that it's as simple as that. There's no decision making or critical thinking. It's just a checklist. So the answer, of course, is it depends. The code book isn't like a cookbook and you can't open it up and get to these 5 things that you need to do. It really does depend. It depends on the size of the building. It depends on how it's constructed. Is the building combustible? Is it non-combustible? What is the egress arrangement? How many stories? Are there other occupancies in the building? What was the existing use of that building prior to the proposing a restaurant in that building? Is it a historical building? So as you can see, there's a lot of room in the codes for the application of the codes to a particular situation, and in some cases, interpretation of the code. So it requires critical thinking and good judgment in understanding the intent of the codes, the flexibility that is in the codes. Now I can illustrate that with this building here. This is at 128 South Market Street, houses Oklahoma Bob's Barbecue. Now, if you've ever been to Worcester, and I highly recommend this place, it gets pretty good reviews. This is on the southeast quadrant of the main square of Worcester. There's that row of buildings. They're sort of set back off the square. There's a strip of parking there in between the buildings. This is a small building. It's about 23 feet wide, 61 feet deep. And the inside is very well done, was remodeled recently. There's a real nice apartment put on the second floor. They probably can have lower rent just based on the fact that you're living above a barbecue place. It's got to smell great in there. But when this building was done, strict compliance with the codes would have required the installation of a sprinkler system in the entire building. At that time, the building, and today, requires, if you're adding new residential, you've got to sprinkle the entire building. Now, I think the owner was estimating that because of the difficulty of getting the water line into this building for the sprinkler system and all that was required, that it was going to cost about $60,000 or $70,000 to fully sprinkle this building. Now, if you think about that, it's a pretty small building. You're going to try to amortize the cost of that sprinkler system over just 2 rents. You're renting out the space for the restaurant, you're renting out the apartment. How long is the payback over an additional $60,000 or $70,000 for a sprinkler system? I think that might have rendered this project undoable. Now, the owner and the designer had a plan for this building, and they put in a completely compartmentalized staircase from the second floor apartment. Now, at that time, if a building was unsprinkled, it required an egress window from the sleeping room. And those requirements have kind of changed in the current code. But if you had a sprinkler system, you didn't need an egress window, but without it, you did. Now, you'll notice on the right side of this picture here, there's an alley. So this building is adjacent to an alley with good fire department access. That is where the new stairway that was compartmentalized exited onto this right-of-way. There was an egress window from the sleeping room on the second floor. They put in all new electrical in this building, a new fire alarm system. And so obviously, even though they were adding residential, the building was going to be much safer than it had been before. But yet they still had to appeal that sprinkler requirement. And this was one of those appeal cases mentioned earlier. And the architect worked with the building department and the fire department to come up with an acceptable plan with those items that I mentioned. And they successfully argued to the State Board of Appeals why an appeal should be granted in this case. And so it was a unique argument tailored for this building situation. And that tells you how powerful that can be, that appeal. So the 102.7 in the administrative chapter, it says the provisions of Chapter 34 shall control the alteration, repair, addition, maintenance, and change of occupancy of any existing building structure. So we can see that generally speaking, by definition, any building downtown or any historic building, they're going to be existing structures. And Chapter 34 is where you're going to look for the provisions dealing with these buildings. Now, if anybody has had any training in the Six Sigma methodology, you'll probably remember that the first phase is define. And I think that's the most important phase probably, and especially true with the building code. Definitions are important. So this lot here, the Commercial and Savings Bank wanted to build a branch. They did build a branch here downtown, and they had plans approved for construction, but a shovel of dirt had not been turned for that project yet. Now, could this be an existing building? So prior to them building, they had some plan revisions. They had submitted plans, they had full plan approval, and then they had some plan revisions. Could those revisions be reviewed under Chapter 34. Well, look here at the definition of existing structure. It says a structure regulated by this code that was erected or one for which plan approval has been issued. So according to the definition in the code, an existing building can be one that hasn't even been built yet, but has plan approval. So theoretically, revisions could be reviewed under Chapter 34. Here's that project recently completed in our downtown. Now this is about 5 or 6 blocks off of the square of Worcester to the east down Liberty Street. So down this section of downtown, there's an old Oldsmobile dealership, there's an old multi-story warehouse building, and it houses one of the social service agencies. So there's some industrial type buildings. I think this was a very nice project. It fit in, very compatible. You can see on the right side on the second floor is an outdoor little meeting space or patio that they put in. It's a pretty unique feature for a bank. So let's talk now about additions in Chapter 34. So you can see again we'll talk about some definitions, but the question is, I have a restaurant downtown. I want to put on an attached deck for dining. Is this an addition? Well, the answer, and everyone should know how to answer that question, is it depends. Now, if you look at the definition, it says an addition is an extension or an increase in floor area or height. Floor area is the floor area within the inside perimeter of the exterior walls. The floor area of the building not provided with exterior walls shall be the usable area under the horizontal projection of the roof or floor above. So here's the deck that was added on to this restaurant. Now this is directly across the street on South Market Street off the square in the first block there, across the street from the City Square Steakhouse, if you know where that's at in Worcester. And so the definition of an extension or an increase in the floor area or height. So it says the floor area within the inside perimeter of the exterior walls. So if you look here, you can see on the right-hand side this metal sheathed wall here. It's sort of a privacy wall or privacy fence. There's a shrubbery built into the wall on the other two sides. You'll see. Now, is this simply a railing around the deck? Is it a fence? Is it a wall? Now, I called this an alteration, that it doesn't increase the floor area of the building, or really the fire area. This is a fully sprinkled building, so if you're increasing the floor area or the fire area of the building, it can have real impacts. Now, the definition said that if you don't have walls, it's the area under the horizontal roof projection or floor above. Well, that doesn't apply here. You see there's some kind of a fabric roof system here, not really a roof area. So again, I call it an alteration, not an addition. So there are different rules that apply. It's not, but it's important, again, for definitions. So when you look on that chapter for additions, you want to make sure you're dealing with addition, and then look at how each of those code sections apply in that section. Incidentally, on this project, this deck was built over the city parking lot. So the building owner got an easement for some of the parking spaces that enabled him to construct this deck out over the parking lot. That's a city-owned parking lot. But it just shows you the cooperation that it takes, from all parties to get something done, and from the city being willing to do that. Now, we're going to take a look at just the definitions of alterations and repairs, and they're treated a little differently in the code than additions. So here in this case, the code is not applicable to minor repairs or maintenance. And a repair is considered minor when it has limited impact on the access or the safety or the health of a building. Now here you had a fire door. So let's say this fire door, it was repaired in this case. They put a new door in. And let's say the existing door, in this case, I don't believe it was a fire door, but when they replaced it, the code requires a fire door now to be put in that place. And or maybe it would require different hardware, or some provision of the code might change. So a repair, the definition is the reconstruction or renewal of any part of a building for maintenance or to correct damage, and it's not subject to the requirements of alteration. So if you view this as a repair, then no fire door would need to be put in its place. You just need to repair the door that's there. Now, if you view it as an alteration, well then it has to meet the provisions of alteration. And alterations have to comply to the code to the extent of the alterations. So such that the existing building can't be any less compliant after the alteration. So again, that may make an impact on how a simple thing like a door replacement is viewed. Now in the picture on the right is the Wayne Center for the Arts. That's an old schoolhouse building that was converted to the Center for the Arts. They replaced all of the windows in that building. Now, the building code has energy efficiency requirements for windows when they're replaced. So in the code, if they're altering the building and replacing the windows, do they have to now comply with the energy efficiency requirements of the code? So again, all of these will come into play depending on the definition and sometimes the interpretation and how these projects are viewed. It's also true with the next section that we're going to talk about, change of occupancy. So a change in occupancy is going to change the risk of the building, the fire safety risk of that building. Now the code has occupancy categories, and so it could be a change in occupancy category, or it could just be a change in the intensity of the occupancy, not necessarily even a change in the category. So for example, the code has an assembly occupancy category. So a restaurant is an A2 occupancy category. And of course, there are codes specifically applied to an A2. There's A1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now let's say you have a restaurant, it's an A2 occupancy category, and it's going to go out of business, and the owner is proposing putting in, say, a concert venue. Now that's an A1 occupancy category. So it's in the same assembly category, but it's a different level of intensity, and there are different code provisions. And so it would require compliance with the code in that case because it's more hazardous, more of a risk. So any change is permitted without full compliance with the code, provided the proposed use is not more hazardous than the existing use. And that's based on an analysis of the life safety and the fire risk. And the code gives you a methodology for performing that analysis. So you can determine the relative risk in these occupancies. So this building is actually not in Worcester, but we had a very similar livery in Worcester, but this is 17 West William Street in Delaware, Ohio. And this is a livery, W.R. Carpenter livery, a stable to board horses, and actually you could rent horses here. And uses do change over time. So if you look in the probably the 1940s, this was the O'Brien Oldsmobile dealership that was there for many years downtown. If you read that writing there on the window, it says the Whirlaway Hydromatic Drive. So still maybe a livery, but you can see that a change in occupancy would change the risk. Here you have gas pumps out front. There's probably mechanical work, welding, gasoline in the building, motor oil. So you can see the code recognizes these changes in level of use of a building, the risk, and the code requirements change accordingly. This is the building today, still, you could argue, a livery, bicycles, the breakaway bicycle shop. And so again, it's all about managing the risk as buildings change over time. I think this is a good illustration for that. But 3408 is a very powerful code section because it is so common for these buildings downtown to change occupancies. And we'll show some of this in Worcester. Now here's that southeast section of our quadrant. You can see on the right that Omaha Bob's barbecue place. Now the two buildings in the center, the 3-story buildings, we had two buildings side by side that were undergoing a renovation almost at the same time. Now both of them had mercantile occupancies for many years on the first floor. The building on the left had 4 apartments on the second and third floors. Now the building on the right had a mercantile and office uses on the second and third floor, didn't have residential. Now both of these buildings were undergoing an alteration. Now the code says for alteration, any construction or renovation to an existing structure other than repair or addition is an alteration. So the code says that they have to comply with the code to the extent of the alteration. So now the building on the left had residential apartments in here for many years. It was not a sprinkled building, never was sprinkled. So sprinklers would not be required in this building because they have to meet the code to the extent of the alteration. So for example, as they're doing a new electrical system in the building, they have to comply with the code for electrical to the extent of the alteration. Now the building on the right, on the other hand, was also undergoing a change in occupancy. So now they were installing market rate apartment on the second and third floor. And so it's an alteration. And so because it was a more hazardous risk, and because the code requires any new residential to be sprinkled, one building may be required to be sprinkled while the other building doesn't have to be sprinkled. And so it's very critical to look at each building, the individual circumstances for each building. Historic buildings. So let's take a look at the code text here for historic buildings. Historic buildings, it says the provisions of this code relating to construction, repair, alteration, addition, restoration, and movement of buildings and change of occupancy shall not be mandatory for historic buildings where such buildings are judged by the building official to not constitute a distinct life safety hazard. And then you have the definition of historic buildings. Listed or certified as eligible for listing by the State Preservation Office. Secondly, designated as historic under an applicable state or local law. Third, certified as a contributing resource within a national register, state designated or locally designated historic district. Now here in Worcester, we are a certified local government. And you can see what the code is getting at here. It clearly requires a sanctioned procedure that establishes when a building gets this historical designation. Now, there's not really going to be any debate between the building official and between the building owner or the architect or designer on whether a building is historic or not. The decision isn't left to the building department, but the decision is put in the hands of qualified people, as mentioned here, who exercise proper judgment for the community with regard to historic buildings. Now, one thing that will do, it of course erases any conflict on what is historic or not. But the other thing that it does, it assures the public that when a building qualifies for special treatment under these provisions in the code, that it does in fact qualify for that special treatment. Now, this historic designation is so critical because, as it says, that the code shall not be mandatory for historic buildings. So that's an important consideration, but also you've got to consider the structural condition of the building, the proposed use of the building, the impact that that proposed use might have on life safety, how the intent of the code may need to be met even if the letter of the code is not met. So there still are other considerations as well. Now, here's some buildings. These would be on our northeast quadrant. This building on the left there, this Art Deco style building, is one building off of the building on the square. So it's in the first block here on the northwest side, or I'm sorry, northeast quadrant, heading down Liberty Street. Now this building on the left was a sporting goods store for many years. And just a piece of Worcester trivia, that building, that sporting goods store, was opened in 1952 by Huntley Pierce. And it was called Pierce's Sporting Goods Store for over 50 years. Huntley Pierce also worked at Isley's, and it said that he made the very first Klondike bar. So there's some trivia. Another bit of trivia that you might find interesting is that he was a founding member of the Worcester Downtown Merchants Association. So here in Worcester, we've had Main Street Worcester for over 25 years. But even before we had Main Street Worcester, we had a Downtown Merchants Association. And so for decades upon decades, people have been working for the improvement of downtown Worcester to get where we are today. Now in the mid-2000s, a restaurant went into the first floor of this, where the sporting goods store was. The sporting goods store remained in business, but moved up to the second and third floors of this building. Now the restaurant that moved in was Muddy's, and it came from another building just down the street here to the right, Liberty Commons, which is sort of an indoor mall building that was renovated. Downtown Medina has a very similar Liberty Commons building, and they're both by the same owner. But in the basement of that building was a coffee shop went in. And that coffee shop was eventually purchased by new owners, and they were expanding, but the downstairs of that building wasn't really appropriate for a restaurant. An A2 use couldn't really go in that building. So the owners moved up to the first floor at street level into this building. Now, there's a plaster barrel vaulted ceiling in this building that's very unique, very historical. And that ceiling was required to be rated because, again, this was a change in occupancy and a change in the risk associated with this building. And so, you know, you could require that ceiling to be tore out and maybe a new fire-rated ceiling put in there. But we were able to go through a process to attribute a rating to that existing barrel vaulted ceiling, and it remained intact there. Some other things were done in that building, but they were able to go in there without the expense and without removing those historical elements of that building, which I think is very important. And it's those elements that give these buildings value. And, you know, let's say you have a building like this and you have 30-inch doors, very ornate doors with ornate trim around the doors. And the code requires a 32-inch door. Now you could require them to tear out those 30-inch doors and all the historical character and value of those doors, but have you really accomplished anything? Have you appreciatively increased the safety of that building by going to a 32-inch wide door? I don't think so. And I think what you've really done is if you do that, you're really tearing down the historical value and the economic impact of that building. And you know, buildings have to have an economic return, so you're really destroying that return in that building. Now, incidentally, that restaurant expanded and needed to enlarge a little bit, so they moved on down the street, down on East Liberty Street, down to where the Oldsmobile dealership was in Worcester, and they're now in that building, and they've installed an outdoor patio off of that building. It's still there. It's still in business today, and it just shows you what typically will happen in a downtown. Uses will expand, they'll change, owners will move, uses come and go. Now, the building in the center there is a graphic design business, and there's residential on the upper 2 floors. The building on the right, one of our local home builders purchased these buildings and remodeled them and moved his home building business, his showroom and offices on the 1st floor. Now, there was an auto parts business on this building. It's a pretty deep building. It goes way back. And so I think this is a less hazardous use than that auto parts business for sure. And of course, residential went in on the upper floors of this building, and a rooftop patio that's very cool on that building. So you can see how these are all historic buildings in Worcester. You have uses come and go, changes come. And so applying the code is very important on these buildings. So accessibility for existing buildings. I want to just touch on this briefly. And we're talking about, accessible building entrances, accessible routes to the building or to a primary function in the building, accessible toilet facilities, doorway widths, ramps, signage, all of these things are accessibility elements in existing buildings. Now, not going to go into too much detail here, but Friday morning I was listening to Ben Levenger. He was discussing economic development in the presentation, and was very interesting, but he briefly discussed this issue, and he made a really important point that I agree wholeheartedly with. He said that accessibility definitely need not be an impediment to development, and I wholeheartedly agree. And Ben also pointed out that it's important for building owners to consult someone who really understands these requirements, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. And you can see just some of the main sections here under accessibility. Change of occupancy, whether it's a partial change or a complete change. The requirements are different for additions and alterations, different if the alteration affects an area of a primary function. There's a section on disproportionate costs and alternatives. There's some scoping for alterations, and then there are some requirements unique to historic buildings. So I'm not going to go into great detail of those, but I'll just tell you, living here in Worcester, we have elevation issues. We've got elevation issues downtown. I like to ride my bike around town, and you're quickly going to find there isn't too many flat areas to ride in Worcester. I mean, you're either going up a hill or you're going down a hill. And it's true with our downtown. And you can look at what might look like it's relatively flat, but if you look a little closer, there's a more severe elevation change than you may realize. And here, this building on the southwest corner, the gift corner, you can see they've got steps here, but if you look off to the right, there's another door at grade. So oftentimes there's opportunity to locate an accessible entrance. It may not be the main entrance, but it may be in the back of these buildings at times, from the side. So there's ways that you can create an accessible entrance. Many of these storefronts have steps going into the main entrance, and these buildings are right on the property line. It's nearly impossible to remove some of these barriers, but it's a challenge. It's been a challenge, and it at times can be a problem in Worcester, but we work hard to work with building owners on these issues. I'd like to talk briefly here about the compliance alternatives of 3412. And as I said, Ohio has a long history with compliance alternatives, with Chapter 34 in general. If you look here at what this section 3412 is, there is a alternative in the code. So it's not complying with any of the other things that we've discussed, but it's a rational basis. This is intended to be a rational basis for establishing the safety of an existing building. Now, it's not supposed to be subjective, I would argue that it's probably still somewhat subjective. This section depends on making a comparison between what the current code would require for an existing building, or for a new building, I'm sorry, and what the conditions are in the existing building. So you're still evaluating the existing conditions in that building, and you're looking at 20 critical areas that the code calls out. And you're looking at each of these areas and the condition of the building and what would be required for a new building, and you're assigning a score to that. And there's a designer that has to be employed to do this analysis. It's not something that the building department does, but it's something that the owner has done. It's a useful tool. It's not really used that often. I think the compliance alternatives that we were discussing earlier are a bit easier. This can be a bit stricter, even sometimes than the building code, especially when you're dealing with smaller buildings and simpler buildings. I think going to those other code sections is way more helpful. But if you're working on a larger building or a more complicated building, then this is definitely a good tool that can really help you. But if you choose to use section 3412, you're not using the other parts of the code. You're not mixing and matching. You can't even appeal any of these code sections. You're strictly sticking to this section. So some of the requirements, it basically says that once this evaluation is done there in the first section, that it shall be accepted by the building official. In 3412.4, it says that it's the building owner that causes the building to be investigated and evaluated. And the next section says that the building official shall determine whether the existing building with the proposed addition, alteration, or change of occupancy complies with the provisions of this section. So it's the building official that determines if that analysis was done properly and if it does in fact comply. So let's look at another building here in Worcester. And this building is on the southwest square. This is a 4-story Italianate building that was built in 1887. It housed the William Annett department store for over a century. So Worcester was very known for 2 large multi-floored department stores, the Annett department store, and then of course Friedlander's, which is no longer. Now this was in the looks like what, the 1950 or 50, 60s here, and an awning was added. It was still the William Annett Company. It had some alterations. And then let's look at this building today. Most of you, if you've been to Worcester, you'll recognize this building. It's very prominent on our square. This alteration to the Everything Rubbermaid store took place in 1993, so it's been there for nearly 30 years. Now, at that time, expertise in these compliance alternatives was very hard to come by. City leaders, and particularly our Main Street Executive Director, Sandra Hall, she was intimately involved in this process, and she reached out to a well-known architectural firm with expertise in this process with historic buildings, Sandvik Architects, and they came in and provided a lot of assistance in remodeling this building at that time in 1993. So again, it just shows you really need specific expertise of someone who understands the complexities of rehabilitating and reusing these large, complicated existing buildings in the downtown. And the way this works here is there's this tabulated score that a building gets in the code. So you have these there's 4 columns here. The 3 columns on the right are fire safety, means of egress, and general safety. On the left-hand column are these 20 or so different categories of the building. Means of egress, corridors, fire sprinklers, and so forth. Now each one of these items, there's a table in the code and you make a comparison. For example, you might make a comparison if you look down at the 5th item there, corridor walls. You might make a comparison of the existing condition of the corridor walls, whether they're rated or not, whether they would be required today if the building was built to be rated or not, and it gives you a score. So for example, if the code would require corridors to be rated and your corridors are not rated at all, you get minus 30 points. And it tells you what, and that's in the first column, but it tells you in each of these columns what score to put for that 5th item. Now, if you had fully compliant corridor walls and rated doors, I believe it gives you a +3 in these columns. So you can kind of see what effect each of these items is going to have on the score, and you can make a determination which of these items it's very important to comply with, and other ones where you can sacrifice some points because it's more difficult maybe to comply. And I think in the case of corridor walls, what it's telling you, because it's such a huge negative score, that probably in any project, you're going to have to rate the corridor walls. It'd be very difficult to do a project and get away with not doing that. And that's sort of the way it works with all of these items as you go on. And so when you're done with this score sheet, you're going to tally the score at the very bottom where these circles are and see what your scores are. And there in the blow up there, you can see the mandatory safety scores. So for example, in this example, if you had a mercantile building and you were going to convert it to a restaurant in A2, you can see in the A2 occupancy category, the mandatory safety scores are 19, 30, and 30. So when you total those columns up, you need to have 19, 30, and 30, or the building doesn't comply. If you have those points, then the building is in compliance. And that's simply how it works. And as I said, it's not a tool that's used that often. It can be very important in larger buildings. So that's really the crux of the building code and how it can help with existing buildings and historical buildings. And we've gone through some of these main code sections. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Tim. Let's give people a moment to get their thoughts and questions in. Please don't be shy about asking Tim. This is a great opportunity to find out more. Again, anyone looking for the AIA credits, Devin has put the learning objectives in the chat box, and you need to email Devin at officemanager@heritageohio.org with your AIA membership number. And let's see, there's something in the chat box. Oh no, that's the AIA credits again. People have been kind of reticent about asking questions. Do you have, one of the things that you mentioned that I've never thought of before is, usually when we think about appealing to the state on the building code, it's like going over your head. I've never thought of the building department being your partner in the appeal process.
Yeah, I think that's an effective way to do that. So essentially, they are appealing the building official's orders that the plans do not comply with the building code, but they're doing so with the support of the building department and ideally with the fire department as well. And so you may agree with the appeal that it should be granted, you just may not have the authority to grant that appeal.
Right. And have you found, again, you were giving some of those numbers, and I remember you said one project, but essentially those appeals are granted as a rule when the building department is your partner.
I think when you have the building department and the local fire department on board, it says a lot to the building department or to the appeal board. And so I think that does have a big impact on them. And of course, you have to have an argument that makes sense for that building.
Okay, we do have a question for you from Van Wert. Mitch asks, would you ever be willing to come do some training to our city about codes?
Sure. I mean, I'm always willing to help if I have time available and we can work something out. I try to make myself available to anybody if I can be of help.
Thank you. Another question. What about historic churches in regard to fire safety, accessibility, any recommendations?
Well, again, if it's a historic church, if it's undergoing, let's say, an addition, then the addition has to comply with the codes. If it's an alteration, you're complying to the extent of the alteration. Uh, if you're talking about a change in occupancy, that's something different. But most of the historic churches that we have, typically they don't change hands very often. I can't even recall of a historic church that's changed occupancies here in our downtown.
Okay, we have another question. What are the changes that you mentioned regarding sleeping room escape windows?
So I think in the current code, if the building's sprinkled, you still need to have egress windows. And I think it depends. Again, there's some exceptions there. You have to look at some of those exceptions and look in detail. But that section has changed recently in the code.
Okay, another trickier question, I think. What makes the difference between the building code official using discretion and or requiring appeal?
That's a good question. So you can liberally construe the code, you can interpret it in the favor of the applicant, but you don't have the authority to waive a provision that does apply. And that's the difference. And so that's when you need to go to the state sanctioned body that can grant that appeal. And sometimes that line can be a little murky at times, and I understand that. So that's where you want to work with your local building official.
Okay, we have another question. Can you elaborate a little more about the arch ceiling compliance by determining the assembly was acceptable? How did it meet the code?
So there is a manual on that you can look at for building elements such as an old plaster ceiling. It's called the Manual on Archaic Materials. And so we cut a hole in that ceiling, depending on the thickness of that plaster and the condition of it, you can attribute a rating to that ceiling. And so that's sort of what we did on that case with the designer's assistance. And we took a close look at that ceiling, and we did not feel that we would appreciatively be increasing the safety of that building by tearing out that historic ceiling and just then turning around and putting in a new rated ceiling.
Okay, we have another question. You mentioned that developers will not put their money where it seems too difficult. Very true. How can we best present an opportunity to a developer for revitalization that might have tricky code issues?
Well, I think you want to involve the building department and the city right from the very beginning, early on. I know that's done here frequently. We have a very good partnership with our economic development group here, WEDC, and with our Chamber of Commerce and the Main Street Worcester. And so the city has an open door policy. So I think that's the most important thing, is everyone to communicate right from the very beginning.
Okay, another question. When there's a bad building code official, does the mayor or the city manager have the ability and or responsibility for firing? Sometimes it seems like people in places of power locally are shirking their duty of making a tough decision and firing someone who needs to be fired.
Okay, that's a tough question, but we do work at the pleasure of the mayor. So of course, the administration, can make a change. That's certainly always possible. So yeah, I think that's the case. It can be done. It may not be done often. I don't know, but I think most of the building departments, have good motives and good intentions and work hard to apply the code and do a good job of it. I understand there can be some problems, but yeah, that's a tricky one.
I guess this is just conjecture. How many building departments, I mean, when you get together with the building code officials, do you think 50%, 75% are really familiar with the alternative building code?
I think the majority are. And so, we have great training on the code. The thing is, it does take experience. So sometimes depending on your level of experience or confidence in applying the code, I probably, viewed the code and applied the code a little differently when I first started out than I do now. But certainly experience makes the difference in any profession or any job. And, that may be really the issue.
Okay, we have a little lag, but please, people, don't be shy about writing your questions in. So what happens is I start closing it and then they start writing questions in. So please get those in. A reminder to everyone while we wait for a few more questions, this afternoon session at 2 o'clock will be accessibility requirements for multifamily housing in historic buildings. And that's being presented by Melinda Shaw and Rachel Eifert from Schooley Caldwell, who are Monday sponsors. And then at 5 o'clock, we have creative uses for public spaces sponsored by the Ohio Arts Council. I haven't seen any more new questions come in, but it's wonderful that we'll have a recording of this presentation. Thank you so much, Tim. And I guess we'll see people at our next session at 2 o'clock. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.